Hey, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Talking Hockey Sense. I'm Chris Peters. This is episode 78 of the podcast. So glad you could join me for it. It is a busy time of year. There is so much going on. We talked about it last week. We're going to talk about a lot of the same things this week, but now we actually have a little bit of extra to talk about because everything is happening as we so discussed last week. So now we've got a little bit of data to share. We've got a little bit more evaluations to share in terms of the Under 18 World Championship. We're going to get into all of it because we've got the Under 18 Worlds, we've got the USHL playoffs, we've got the ECHL playoffs. We've got a lot of different things that are involving NHL prospects, and we are going to talk about it today. But before we get into that, make sure that you are following this podcast in all the different ways that you can. If you're an audio person, certainly download it, subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts. We're always available there, and you can also leave a kind rating and review to help get the word out about the podcast. Or you can watch us on YouTube and on FloHockey.tv. Certainly the Flow Sports app, another great resource for you. And if you haven't yet already, make sure you are subscribed to Flow Hockey for all of the USHL playoffs and the ECHL playoffs, the Clark Cup for the USHL, the Kelly Cup for the ECHL, both on the line, both underway. And it is the best time of year. So make sure you are subscribed up for that because we have had a lot to watch in both of those postseasons so far, and we will cover some of that on today's show. But since we like to talk a lot about the NHL draft prospects, and certainly the 2023 NHL draft has some big time dates coming up here in the very near future, including on May 8th, the draft lottery will be held. And while we figure that'll let us know where Connor Bedard is going with whoever gets the number one pick. After that, really, who knows? And some of that is going to get sorted out in the coming weeks. Adam Fantilli, who's the consensus, number 2, number 3, number 4, depends on who you ask, but usually number 2. Certainly for me, he is going to the World Championship to play for Canada, which is a great thing for them and a great thing for him as well to prepare for his NHL draft season. But the vast majority of NHL draft prospects that we can talk about right now are playing at the Under 18 World Championship in Switzerland. And, it pains me not to be there among the snow-capped mountains and everything else, but we've got a lot going on. So not there like I usually would be this time around, but hopefully we'll get back there. But even so, one of the reasons not to go is that we already knew that the U.S. is a very dominant team with the 4 NHL draft prospects that could go as high as the top 15, all 4 of them, and 3 of them are on one line. And as expected, they have been dominant to date. Team USA is 4-0. They have the number 1 seed as we're recording this. So, we will have, depending on when you listen to this, there could be a couple of games that have already happened. The quarterfinals are on Thursday. And then the gold medal will be handed out on Sunday, and we will have a recap of the U18 Worlds next week. But while things are in progress, the U.S. has done very well. Sweden has done very well, undefeated. They started their tournament with an 8-0 win over Canada. We've seen flashes of really competitive flashes from both Slovakia and Czechia at this tournament as well. And then Canada has seemed to get it back on the rails after that drubbing to start the tournament from Sweden. So a lot of potential here, but the story of the tournament so far has been Team USA, and it has been the 2-4-9 line. That's number 2, Will Smith, number 4, Gabe Perreault, and number 9, Ryan Leonard. 3 players we've talked about a lot on this podcast, but they just keep giving us so much to talk about. And now they are dominating the Under 18 World Championship in a way that, well, we just frankly haven't seen before. Now, you do have to keep in mind there is no Russia in this tournament. Team USA is in the weaker of the 2 brackets. They had both Norway and Latvia in the same bracket, so we kind of expected them to dominate, but they also dominated Team Finland, which was the most competitive game, and Team Switzerland, which is the tournament host. So Team USA rolling right now. As for those 3 players specifically, Will Smith and Gabe Perreault each have 15 points so far to start the tournament. Ryan Leonard has 13 points. Those are your top 3 scorers in the tournament to date. Underager Cole Eiserman, who is not draft eligible until 2024, is currently in 4th in the tournament scoring, tied for 4th in tournament scoring with 9 points, but leads the tournament with 8 goals. So an incredible performance from the 16-year-old Cole Eiserman as well. But if you've been seeing the headlines, and we have a story up on FloHockey as well about Gabe Perreault, he has broken Austin Matthews' single season record for points at the National Team Development Program. Now, the NTDP takes into account all of the stats that a player compiles in their season because they have such a wide-ranging schedule. So every game that those players play is into the historic record of their statistics, and the same was true of Austin Matthews and players of years past. Austin Matthews had 117 points, of course, now a superstar, a number one overall draft pick. Jack Hughes had 116 points as a U17, so he was in that mix. Well, now Gabe Perreault has surpassed that total. He has 129 points as we record this. So he's not only broken the record, he has shattered it and then continues to build on top of it. And then also the other day, Will Smith also surpassed Austin Matthews. He now has 121 points. I think that's pretty incredible to see what both of those players have done. They are both averaging 2.14 or higher. Smith has 2.14 points per game, and then Gabe Perreault has 2.15 points per game, both incredible highs for the National Team Development Program. And while Ryan Leonard doesn't have as many points as the other two, he does have almost 50 goals. He's on 49 goals after a hat trick against Switzerland. So we are talking about a line that is rewriting the record books at the National Team Development Program, and also a group of players that is defying what we believe possible at the U18 World Championship. Now, I mentioned there, Smith and Perreault are at 15 points, and Leonard is at 13 points. They are all ahead of the pace that Nikita Kucherov had. And now Nikita Kucherov, of course, a Hart Trophy winner. Somebody, he ended up as a second-round draft pick even after this Under-18 World Championship performance. But he had 21 points at the 2011 World Under-18 Championship. These guys are on pace for 26. The top two guys are on pace for 26 points, which would be a single tournament record. They also have the chance to set the U.S. record, which was set by Jack Hughes in 2019. He had 20 points in that tournament. Absurd to think anybody could reach 20 or more points. We're talking about potentially 26 points if these guys are able to keep their point totals going in that direction over the last three games of the tournament. Now, they've got to beat Czechia in the quarterfinals to advance, and then they'll go to the semifinals in the bronze medal game. So if you win on Thursday, you're guaranteed two more games, and we'll see how much further these gentlemen can extend the record that they've already set, and then to see how much else happens. But we're talking about three guys that are 2023 draft eligible. I think, we've talked a lot about how Perreault is kind of behind all three of those players, or the other two guys on his line in terms of the draft projections. I think the gap is narrowing because there's only a certain point where you have to say the production is the production. It can't get much better than that. And it really would be hard to get much better than what Gabe Perreault has done this season. So I think that, we're going to see a lot of scouts start to move him up the list. The concerns are that his size is certainly below average, about 5'11". Skating is below average for the NHL level, but the hockey intelligence, the hockey sense, the vision, the ability to finish plays. I mean, we talk about, lots of guys can make plays. Gabe Perreault not just makes them, he finishes those plays. He's got goal scoring ability. He's already up over 50. I believe he has 56 goals at the moment as we're recording this. And so, he told me, sorry, it's 53. He told me, a couple of weeks ago, and you can actually, we'll have some video features coming up on FloHockey. We already have one on Will Smith and Ryan Leonard, but our Gabe Perreault one is coming. He told me his goal coming into the season was to hit 40 goals. Well, he's well past that, and that was something that he just was kind of hoping he could hit. But to have over 50 goals, to have 120 plus points and almost 130 at this point, it just truly is remarkable. So we'll see Gabe Perreault move up the list. Will Smith has been a guy that's been towards the top of the draft rankings for most of the season because he's really been impressive from the very beginning. Did miss some games, which is why he's probably a little bit further behind the pace. Similar points per game to Gabe Perreault, but just incredible vision, incredible poise, incredible puck handling ability. That is another big element for this player. He is going to continue to move up those charts. We think he'll probably land within the top 5 to 6 picks of this draft. It could be interesting to see, where does he go relative to Matvei Michkov, given all of the, the Russian hysteria and certainly the concerns over potentially drafting Michkov. Does Will Smith sneak into that top 4? He was 3rd by NHL Central Scouting. And then the guy that was also very high on NHL Central Scouting's rankings was Ryan Leonard. And Leonard has had a tremendous tournament with 13 points. I've talked to a number of scouts that, would say, hey, we like all 3 of these guys, but this is the one that we feel most comfortable projecting for the NHL because of his overall toolkit. And that is, he's not a tall player, but he's very sturdy, very strong, certainly the strongest of the 3, a physical player, a hard-nosed player, and then you also add the skill element to it, and that's what makes Ryan Leonard so special. We've got that video feature about Ryan Leonard where we talk a lot about the power elements of his game. You can see that on YouTube or on FloHockey.tv. Same with the Will Smith feature. And then we also had one on Oliver Moore, who's not scoring as many points as those 3, but still making a significant impact as the number 2 center. The number 2 power play for Team USA, which now features more with Cole Iserman and James Hagans. They have been dominant at this tournament as well. We've seen Oliver Moore score a couple of really nice goals or score a really nice goal, and then also producing some points and playing a good two-way game. We got a feature about him as well that you should absolutely check out. Really excited to have some of those video features to add to our NHL draft coverage that we'll have here at FloHockey. But I mean, there's only so many ways I can try and contextualize for you the insanity of what these players are doing. But the 249 line, call 911 if you're on the opposing defense, because those guys are just absolutely dominant right now, seemingly unstoppable, but they have at least three, or a maximum of 3 more games to go before they're able to really end this season on the highest possible note, which would be to end USA's gold medal drought, which dates back now we're closing in on 6-7 years now, the way things are going with them. Before we move on from under 18 World Championship talk, I did just want to quickly touch on some of the other teams. I mean, Canada had their really tough first game, but we've seen some really good performances from them since. They had their hands full with Slovakia, but they've had some more dominant showings as well. Macklin Celebrini from the Chicago Steel in the USHL as an underage in this tournament has continued to play at a high level. He's centering their top line with Callum Ritchie and Matthew Wood. It's been an incredible line for them. Wood had a hat trick the other day. He was a guy that went really high up on NHL Central Scouting's list. I think we're talking about a guy that's probably no worse than a top 15 pick, probably a top 10 at this point. He has continued to show that. He has size. He has hockey sense. He's got the ability to score goals. His down-low play has been very strong. That has all been evident here at this tournament, and that is why he's a guy that has such high upside for the NHL draft. Callum Ritchie led Team Canada at the Hlinka Gretzky Cup this summer in scoring. He's leading Team Canada now at the Under 18 World Championship. Didn't have an amazing OHL season. Didn't blow anybody away with his production this year, but he is a very good young player. He has shown that on multiple international settings. He's always been a player that stands out in my personal live viewings of him. But the issue is, how much do we weigh what he did internationally against his age peers versus what he did at the junior level? And those are things that we still have to square, but he's played very well. There have been a couple of other players that have had kind of up and down tournaments. Carson Bjarnason, one of the top tier goalies for this draft, has not necessarily performed at a high level here in this tournament. He is a very interesting prospect. He has a lot of the tools. It just hasn't necessarily translated into significant success between the pipes for Team Canada. Also, you've got Lukas Dragicevic, who we've talked about as a potential defenseman in this draft that could go in the first round. He's kind of been up and down. He was actually a -5 against Sweden to start the tournament. He has scored some nice goals. He's showed an ability to move pucks. He's been on the top power play unit. So he does a lot of things but I think that we want to see a little bit better defensive sense, a little bit better and more confident play in the D zone against his age peers. That hasn't necessarily been the case. I think we've seen some times where he's gotten a little bit lost. And then Canada is getting a nice addition to their blue line. They are going to get Etienne Morin, who played an outstanding QMJHL season, has a chance to go in the first round of this year's draft. He is joining Team Canada late because Quentin Burns got injured and will not be able to continue the tournament. So that allows Canada to add a new player. But Canada has done some really nice things. Sweden has been another big story on this in this whole tournament. They've been outstanding in terms of their point production, their offense, but most impressively, they've only allowed, or they've 3 of their 4 games so far they have not allowed a goal, and they're playing in the far tougher bracket of the 2 brackets. They shut out Canada. They had their hands full against Slovakia. They were good against the Czechs. They were good in their other games as well. And so against Germany, they had their hands full against Germany, but they still managed to get out with the win and also a shutout. They're led by Otto Stenberg, who's been a really good player internationally. I think he's a guy that is probably a late first-round pick at this point. Axel Sandin Palika has been an outstanding player for them as well. He is a tremendous defenseman in terms of his mobility and his hockey sense and his ability to move pucks as well. Does he have necessarily dynamic puck skills? I wouldn't say that, but he just makes a lot of the right reads and makes a lot of strong plays. He had 5 points against Canada in the opening game, and he's had 1 point since, but still, I like the way he's played in the D zone. I like the leadership he's shown. This is a guy that played at the under 18 or the under 20s, the World Juniors earlier this year. And then also Theo Lindstein and Tom Willander, 2 defensemen that are really moving up charts. I think that they are having the kind of tournament that really you want to move those guys up your board. You see a lot of the tools that they are able to possess. It's just going to be a matter of trying to weigh that against what we saw the rest of the season. Willander is expected to come play for Boston University next year, which is a very interesting and intriguing thing considering they both have Celebrini and Willander coming in next season, which will be amazing. I believe it's probably technically pronounced Vilander, but because this is America and we do that sort of thing, it's Willander for familiarity purposes for the audience more than anything else. But those are guys that you're absolutely going to have to be aware of for potential first rounders. It's not a good year for defensemen. Those guys have played really well. I've liked Dalibor Dvorsky in this tournament. I've liked Edward Shala in spurts. I think he's been a little bit disappointing overall in terms of what he could be. But those are players that have a lot to prove in this tournament. So we'll talk a lot more about the other high end performances. We'll talk about the winners of this tournament next week, but a really, really impressive group of players. And before we move on, I did get a couple of questions specific to the under 18 team and also to this tournament that I thought I would answer now as opposed to at the end of the podcast, which is, we've got a couple of questions from some of our listeners, and I'm always happy to answer them because, I think that this is this first one that we got from our friend Tim here is a really interesting one because he asks, who do you identify as the main driver for that insane USNTDP line? Is it Perreault? Great question, and it's one that's not easily answered because I think that when you talk about that 249 line, at various times in various games, you will see them each one of them kind of takes turns, and it's not predetermined. It's just whoever is going. I would say that Smith is the primary driver of the line. I think even, Ryan Leonard, when he was talking about Will Smith to me earlier in some of our feature stories, he basically defines Will Smith as a driver, and I do as well. And that's a reason why there are some doubts about him being able to play center at the NHL level. The reason that I think he can is because he's a play driver. And he carries the puck a lot. He thrives when he has the puck on his stick, and when he does have it on his stick, he makes things happen. He's got good one-on-one skill. He's able to make defenders miss. He's had many instances of that this year, but so can Gabe Perreault and so can Ryan Leonard. At various points in various games, you will see one of those guys take over, and it's just kind of who's going. And whoever's going, that's the guy that's driving the line. Now, Perreault certainly has the most points. I think the reason that he has the most points and one of the reasons that he's so good is that his ability to play off of the other guys is really impressive because you kind of lose him sometimes. And I don't mean that in like he gets invisible. It's that he's able to find the soft areas of the ice. He's able to get into the right places. And then Will Smith just finds him. And then he finds whoever he's got to do, whether it's the goal or whether it's the next thing. But to me, the primary driver of the line is Smith, but all 3 of them possess the ability to do it. And I think they have to do it that way. The reason they have so many points as a group is because they each have that capability and they can kind of trade off, and that makes them all very special players. All right, our next one comes from Eric, which made me think a little bit. So I mean, that's a good thing. You got to think a little bit, right? So this one comes from our pal Eric, and he asks, "Is Oliver Moore significantly more or less interesting as a prospect in this year's draft compared to Frank Nazar in last year's draft, and why? And as much as I've read about they have similar profiles. Nazar had slightly better numbers, and Moore has slightly better size." Well, I think the big separating factor between these two players, and Frank Nazar, of course, was a first round draft pick of the Chicago Blackhawks last year. High, basically kind of in that similar. He was behind Logan Cooley, often playing center or wing on the second line for Team USA. He was pretty dynamic, and he made a lot of plays. I'd say that the separating factor between these two players is Oliver Moore's speed. Now, Frank Nazar is quick. He did have a significant injury that I think forced a little bit of a setback in terms of his skating ability, in terms of what we saw at the University of Michigan this year. I think he'll be fine there. But Oliver Moore's explosiveness as a skater, I mean, we're talking about the best skater in the draft here. He's certainly one of the fastest players that we'll have in 2023. And the reason that to me is part of what makes him a little bit more interesting, in that, I think that Nazar was the more dynamic offensive player, whereas Oliver Moore is the more well-rounded, kind of does a little bit of everything, does a lot of the things that help you win. That's why I think he's a little bit more interesting in terms of team fit. But there's a lot to like about him. There's certainly other things that give you pause in terms of, does he have the dynamic? Is his offense going to translate to the NHL level? Is there a dynamic enough skill set? I think his hands are fine. I think his shot is very good. I think he sees the ice very well, and he's only going to get better just because he's really still growing into his game with the speed that he has and the strength that he has. And those are two major separating factors for Oliver Moore, and why I think, Nazar went in the mid-teens. I think that Moore probably ends up going in a similar-ish range, if not a little bit higher. Potentially, I mean, there's always the chance he could sneak into the top 10 as well, because I think the consensus is starting to fall away from that group. So a lot there to think about, but really good question. And I think Oliver Moore is quite the prospect, regardless. So very good stuff there from Eric. And now we move on to our next topic, because I'll tell you what, the USHL playoffs, it is a bit of a sprint at this point. The very beginning of the playoffs is a sprint as opposed to the marathon that you see in most other playoffs. Why is that? Best of 3 series. Now, the USHL season ended on Saturday, and we started our first round of the playoffs on Monday. 1 day rest for everybody. The teams there are certain teams hosting, and then you're playing all 3 games at one site. So, Cedar Rapids goes to play Team USA. You have Des Moines going to play Lincoln. You have Dubuque at Green Bay. So, these are some of the first round series. So as we record this, the night that this episode will be up, will be the end of the first round. There were only 2 series that ended up going to a game 3. The next round, same situation where you've got, but there on that other side of that are the 4 teams that had a bye out of the first round. That's the top 2 teams from each conference. So out west, it's Fargo and Waterloo. In the east, it's Chicago and Youngstown. And so those are the teams that are going to be playing. They're going to certainly be favored. They're going to have home ice advantage. And then once we get out of that series, that's when we'll move into the conference finals, and then the USHL Clark Cup finals. And that will be best of 5 series. But this is a really interesting time in the USHL, because you get yourself in. 12 of the 16 teams are going to get into the playoffs, and they did this time around. And now you kind of have to sort things out. That first round, you have 2 bad games, your season is over. You have a bad bounce here or there, your season could be over. There's not a lot of room for error. And it makes for some drama, and it makes for some excitement as well, as we've seen. Lincoln Stars got a big goal from a Detroit Red Wings prospect, Brendan Ali. They end up sweeping Des Moines. They move on. We've seen some drama in terms of the U.S. and the U.S. National Under 17 team at the national team program playing against Cedar Rapids. Cedar Rapids, big win the first night. USA comes back the next night. So that's just kind of the way that these playoffs are set up. So I did want to quickly touch on a couple of the players that I think you should be particularly aware of this postseason, and certainly there's more than a few. But what'll be interesting is that Chicago Steel will start this postseason without Macklin Celebrini. He's not going to be there because he's with Team Canada at the World Under-18 Championship. So you're missing the probable USHL MVP, certainly the Rookie of the Year, and certainly one of the best players that we've seen in this league in a long time. Now you got to go into your first round series without him because he's at the Under-18 Worlds, and you've got a big series here coming up, to be determined as we await the winners of those first round series. So the Chicago Steel will be without Macklin Celebrini. So what does that mean? That means there's a lot more pressure on Jaden Perreault. Jaden Perreault is the one of the top draft prospects in the USHL this year. He's a highly skilled player. He doesn't have tremendous size. He doesn't have the super dynamic skill set, but he's certainly skilled, and he makes defenders miss. He can get in. I think he can do a lot of things well. Where he ultimately gets drafted, still to be determined. I think there are certainly teams that could consider him in the late first round. I think it's more likely he's an early day 2 pick. But playing well in the playoffs will help. And one of the things about it is, how does he do away from Macklin Celebrini? He's been able to connect a lot with Perreault this year. The two have fed off of each other. They've assisted on each other's goals quite often. So now it's got to be the Jaden Perreault show. He's going to be a fascinating player to watch for the remainder of the playoffs. Over in Fargo, there's just a plethora of players, but I think the guy that's driven a lot of the headlines and certainly has played at an exceptional rate this year is Cole Knuble. Another, he's a multi-year draft eligible. If you didn't see the video yet, his dad, Mike Knuble, who you certainly know from the National Hockey League, played over 1,000 games in the NHL. In the final game of Fargo's regular season, they let Mike Knuble do the beer can races where they let the guys, it's kind of like the sausage races in Pittsburgh, but instead of that, it's beer cans. And he was rocking the Bud Light beer can outfit, and he destroyed the field, took out all of his fellow Fargo Force dads. Still didn't end up winning, but he made sure that the Truly seltzer can got every bit of the feel of what it must have felt like to play against Mike Knuble in the NHL, because he was laying the lumber out there. Let me tell you that much. And so you can go check that out on YouTube, seeing Mike Knuble in a beer can demolition derby kind of situation. But as far as Cole goes, Cole is a higher end offensive talent, and so if he can be a guy that really drives things. Fargo won the Anderson Cup as the regular season champion. It managed to hold off Chicago at the very end of the season to win the Anderson Cup, their first in franchise history. And, this is a very interesting time for Fargo. They lost their owner last year, Ace Brandt, who passed away tragically. And they've been playing just incredible. They've got a new head coach in Nick Oliver. Kerry Eads has been at the helm of that team for the last few years. He coached for a bit. Now he's in the management role. Former assistant coach at the University of North Dakota. They've put together a tremendous team, and certainly this is a team that I think is the team to beat in these playoffs. And so that's going to be very fascinating to watch. But another team to keep a particularly close eye on, the Waterloo Blackhawks. They loaded up at the trade deadline. They brought in a guy like Mikko Matika. They made some adds to their blue line. They've got good goaltending. They've had it all season. They've got Sam Rinzel, who's the first-round draft pick from the Chicago Blackhawks. They have Gavin Thorson, who was a top player in Minnesota high school hockey this year. That was added to the mix on the roster as well. They've gotten good goaltending from Emmett Crotto and Jack Spicer. The guys that have made some really big strides. And they're coached by Matt Smaby, who is a former NHL player. He's really early in his coaching career. But I really like the program that he's run there. I think that Waterloo had a really strong season. Fascinating to see kind of where they end up. But hopefully we'll get a better idea in the near future about what this Clark Cup playoff is actually going to look like. So after we record this tonight, the first round will conclude. The second round will continue at the end of the week and through the weekend. So make sure you check that out on FloHockey. A lot of NHL draft prospects, a lot of names that we haven't discussed yet to know, but we will talk about them more as the USHL playoffs progress. So stay tuned for that. Lots of great hockey action there. Speaking of playoff hockey, we're going to close things out, and then we'll get to our Q&A, getting back to the NHL draft coverage, but I quickly wanted to touch on the ECHL Kelly Cup playoffs, which are ongoing. The first round, every series is best of 7. We're going to try to crown a champion. But why bring it up on a prospect-centric podcast? Well, the very interesting thing about the ECHL playoffs this year is how the goaltending situation looks. Now, we've known for the last several years that the NHL continues to look to the ECHL to be a primary training ground for their young goaltending prospects. Guys that are under NHL contract that are sent, instead of going to the AHL, are sent to the ECHL, and they're sent there to be in specific situations like this one, where it is the playoffs, the pressure is on, you have to perform. Some of these guys are in their second ECHL season, or maybe they played in the AHL last year, or this is their first year of professional hockey. So there's a lot to be learned for these players. And what have we learned so far from a lot of these NHL contracted players? They've been really good. Sebastian Cossa, we've talked about him a million times on this podcast, and we'll talk about him more again because he did start games 1 and 3 for Toledo. They're in a very unique position because they have 2 goalies under NHL contract. Cossa is the golden goose. He is the top goaltending prospect for the Detroit Red Wings. First round draft pick. He plays games 1 and 3. John Leatherman plays game 2. He's the ECHL goaltender of the year. So, how do you leave that guy on the bench? But this is kind of the way it works in down in the farm system. You have to have some mandates from that NHL team. You've made some agreements, and Detroit obviously wants to see Sebastian Cossa. Well, the good news for Toledo, through their first 3 games as we record this, Cossa was lights out against the Indy Fuel. He has, the highest save percentage of any goalie that started at least 2 games in this tournament so far, or in this playoff so far. So you really have to be excited about what the youngster has done. He's the youngest player, has been, until they started adding players out of junior this year, the youngest player in the ECHL for most of this season. And this has been a great year of development for him. Same can be said for Trent Miner, Colorado Avalanche, 7th round draft pick, under NHL contract, playing for the Utah Grizzlies. Now, the Utah Grizzlies, I think everybody left them for dead because they were playing the Idaho Steelheads, who had the most wins of the season. 58 wins, a record in the ECHL. They won the regular season championship. First 2 games, Idaho is on home ice. First 2 games, they lose. And they lose mainly because Trent Miner was so good in net for the Grizzlies. He had a shutout in game 1, was dynamically, was a huge factor in game 2. Now the series shifts back to Salt Lake City. They're going to play in Utah for 3 consecutive games. So now the Grizzlies are in a position to potentially eliminate the regular season champion. And I cannot wait to see how that goes. And it's largely because of their NHL prospect in net in Trent Miner. Ryan Fanti, Edmonton Oilers, undrafted free agent, signed by the Oilers, sent to the Fort Wayne Komets, spent a lot of time there this year, had several viral moments. He scored a goal. He had a fight. There was an assist at some point earlier this year. We're calling it the Ron Hextall hat trick. Maybe we got to call it the Ryan Fanti hat trick. Either way, Ryan Fanti has been not just a viral sensation, he's actually been progressing this season. I got a chance to see him up close live against the Iowa Heartlanders this year, and he was dominant in that game. Looked like an NHL goalie. Well, he did that again recently at a 35-save shutout with his team on the ropes. And these are the situations when you put players in the ECHL that you want them to be in, and he goes out and has a shutout. Clay Stevenson of the South Carolina Stingrays, his team loses the first game. He makes his first professional playoff start the next night, 27-save shutout against the defending Kelly Cup champions. This is what, when we're watching these games, and the Kelly Cup on its own, very exciting. I mean, playoff hockey, it doesn't matter the level, it doesn't matter where you're at, it is a thrill. But to see these young players come into a league, and the ECHL is not an easy league to play in. You have to earn everything you get there, even if you're a top-tier prospect, because it is not easy. There's a lot of guys with a lot of experience and a lot of skill. They've performed at a super high level. It's been fascinating to watch. I think it's outstanding to see what these young goaltenders have done at the ECHL level. And, as far as prospect viewings go, there's no better time to get into the ECHL than right now. If you're a fan of goaltending, there are so many young goalies in this league that are performing at an extremely high level. And that doesn't even, not even mentioning Adam Scheel, who had a great season and is a Dallas Stars prospect. There are other Mikey DiPietro playing for Maine Mariners. I mean, there are a lot of names in this league at the goaltending position in particular that you should absolutely keep an eye on. And those are just a few of them there. All right, we're going to move on and close out the show as we so often do with your questions. And I got a number of NHL draft questions that we're going to kind of go through a little bit rapid fire because I think that they're, some of them, they're pretty easy to answer. And that includes this first one. And this one comes from Jesse. Jesse asks, let's pretend that Matvei Michkov was in the CHL or the NCAA this season rather than the KHL situation he currently is. Is Fantilli still the number 2 pick, or does Michkov join the conversation for who goes after Bedard? It's something we've tried to answer throughout the year because, we talk about Michkov a lot, and all of the reasons that he probably won't go number 2, you can't just discount. You can't wave him away. The Russian issue is very much in play. But what I will say is if you take him out of the setting that he's currently in, and you put him in the CHL or NCAA hockey, I think that more than likely he would have a pretty historic level of production. He is an incredibly intelligent player. He's one of the smartest offensive players I've had a chance to track. But it's not a straight one-to-one where, if you say, well, if he does that, then, Fantilli's cast to number 3. Don't necessarily think that's true. Michkov is a wing. Fantilli is a center. Fantilli has a size and speed advantage over Michkov. He has a grit factor. There's also the physicality. And then on top of that, he's still an elite offensive player. So he's got a bit of a different package. So I don't think that you could necessarily say if we put Michkov in and he has, let's say he does replace Connor Bedard's historic production this year in the WHL, then yes, we start thinking about it. But I think that's the kind of performance it would take to overtake a guy like Fantilli, who had a historic season in college hockey himself. And then also has the size and the physicality and the other things that go with it. So I think it's very difficult to project that out. I still think, Fantilli would have a strong case, but no question, Michkov is more firmly entrenched in that discussion for number 2 had he been in North America and we didn't have as many concerns as we do, not the least of which is the fact that he's under contract for a few more seasons. All right, our next question comes from Aaron, and this is team specific. We don't mind those; always interesting. He asks, "Curious, what St. Louis does with its first-round picks this year? Their defense has a lot of money invested in 30-plus-year-old defensemen. Wondering how you would use their draft capital." Well, it's always good to have more, right? It's always good to have a number of draft picks like they do, and I think that's that puts you in a position to have options. So using that draft capital in a variety of ways. I mean, we think St. Louis has a chance with the way the draft lottery is set up that they could potentially pick pretty high in this draft. They're not, they don't have the best odds, but it's at least a possibility that they move up. So I think no matter what, you aren't doing anything with that number. That pick that falls within the top 10 or 12 or 13. So you don't do anything with that. You save that. But the next picks, those are the ones where you say, okay, well, what do we do? You've got, it obviously depends on how the season ends for these other teams, but they've got New York's first round pick, and they've got Toronto's first round pick. And so having those options available to you, I think that those picks are the kind that you could package to potentially move up. There are picks that you can potentially use later in the draft. So you mentioned specifically the 30-year-old defenseman. I think with that first pick that they have, it's unlikely that there's going to be, unless maybe there's David Reinbacher and maybe you feel strongly enough about him to potentially take him early there. And I think they'd be in a range where they would get him, and I still think that that's an acceptable pick. Of the defensemen, I do think David Reinbacher is the best. I think he's got a lot of the tools that a team's covet. He's certainly one of those guys that they're going to be looking at with that pick. As for the next 2 picks, I think that as you get further and further into the first round, you're maybe not feeling as strongly about some of those players. But I would say that, there's going to be good picks there. Like if you look at that range, if they're late in that first round, I think about a guy like Gavin Brindley that checks a lot of the boxes of the kind of player that St. Louis likes in terms of his grit and his tenacity. He's not a big guy, so they don't love that, but he's not a big guy, but he plays with some spark and some energy. That's a guy that should be available in the range of those other 2 picks. There's nothing wrong with using all three of them. I think that every team that has multiple first rounders, they feel emboldened. We've seen it, like a couple of years ago, New Jersey had 3 picks. They got really good players, and then they also decided, they wanted to go take a swing with their 3rd pick and went with Shahir Mukhamadullin. And he's no longer part of their organization. He was traded, but that was an asset that they were able to use and maybe take a little bit more of a chance on. And the early returns, it looks like they made a good gamble there, especially now that they were able to package him in a trade. So, I think that for the Blues in particular, they're in such a position of strength because I don't think they're very far away in terms of being able to reconstruct what they have around a core. But yeah, you mentioned it. There are definitely going to be some needs there that they're going to have to address. But I think they're going to have plenty of options, and having options is a very, very good thing. All right, our next question is from Kevin, and this is a little bit more inquisitive, and it's good for the audience to hear as well. So Kevin says, Chris, do you know if Grayson Sachin represents the USA or Canada internationally? Just wondering if he gets invited to one of the junior camps this summer, assuming you would have to figure that out soon. Kevin, good question. So Grayson Sachin is a dual citizen. He did play at the National Team Development Program briefly. Did leave to go play in the WHL, playing for Seattle. He had a really good draft season, a very solid all-around player, but certainly especially great with the hands. Really good hand skills, makes a lot of different plays that a lot of players can't. I would assume that going through the NTDP tips the hand a little bit, that he was leaning towards representing the United States. I would imagine that he would be among the invites for the World Junior Camp this summer. I couldn't tell you with definitive knowledge of that. But certainly he would be in the mix for that. Canada, as far as we know, will not have a World Junior Camp. So we don't necessarily know if he'll have to make that decision. Technically, he doesn't. The double IHF would potentially get involved if, say, he wanted to play for one of these countries and it didn't fit the rules properly. You're supposed to be in the same country for 2 years. I think he fits all that criteria in terms of his ability to play for Team USA. Less certain than he would for Canada. But interestingly enough, his younger brother, Lucas, also just signed a tender with the Chicago Steel. So he's, at least for now, going the U.S. route out of Shattuck St. Mary's. All right, we got ourselves another USHL related question here. And this one comes from User, a very creative name. User says, where do you see Jacob Fowler and Michael Perreault being selected in the draft? So 2 USHL goaltenders, Fowler for the Youngstown Phantoms, Perreault for the Omaha Lancers. He's currently playing at the Under-18 Worlds for the Czechs, and will have to go toe-to-toe with the U.S., who he actually had a tremendous game with at the beginning of the season that generated so much draft buzz for him. But really interesting. So this is a tough one to answer because I think knowing where the goalies are going to go this year is anybody's guess. There are absolutely some goalies that could potentially go in the first round. It's more likely they're early day 2 picks. And I would say Perreault is more of these 2 that we're talking about. Excuse me. Of these 2 that we're talking about, Perreault is more likely to go in the first round of the 2, but not necessarily. I don't think it's a lock that he would. I think in terms of tools, he has the 6'6" frame, he has the athleticism, he's got the technique. There's a lot of different things there that he's very good at. He is committed currently to UMass, which has had a good success with their goaltenders in recent years. So I think he's, of those 2, he has the highest potential to go. He'll be the higher selected of the 2, almost certainly. Jacob Fowler, I think more likely is a mid-round pick. I think it's probably in the 3rd to 4th round range for him. Even though he's had a really great season, has done just about everything right, has done so much well. He's headed to Boston College next year as part of one of the best recruiting class, probably the best recruiting class. It is the best recruiting class in the country, joining Will Smith and Ryan Leonard and Gabe Perreault there. So he's got a lot there. Jacob Fowler has plenty of upside. He's played extremely well. I think if he has a big postseason in the USHL, you might even see him sneak into that 2nd round range. but he is absolutely among the goaltenders that will be drafted and probably early-ish on day 2. And then our final question is also a goaltending question, and this one comes from Jake, and he asked, what are your thoughts on Hampton Slakinski? Very few high school goalies get drafted. Do you think he can be one of them? That's a tough one to answer. He's currently playing for Team USA at the World Under-18s. He's basically their number 3 goalie right now, but he did play most of the season or pretty much all the season at Warroad High School. I thought he was really good there. I did see some of his games. I was very interested in watching Warroad for Jason Chagabe and Carson Pilgrim, who's a guy for next year that'll be interesting. But he was really good in general. And the thing is will he get drafted? It's really hard to predict if these high school goaltenders will get drafted. I think if I were a team, I would be wanting to see more of him at a different level. I would want to see a little bit more. And, I wouldn't feel comfortable using a draft pick on a player that I've seen primarily at a lower level, not facing the quality of shots that junior goaltenders face. I think that would be a big concern of mine in drafting him. So I don't necessarily think that he will be drafted, but I don't think that he's a guy that will be off NHL radars in the end. So keep an eye on him. He's going to be an interesting player. I just don't necessarily see a path towards drafting him, getting him drafted this year, but NHL teams always do things that surprise me at the draft, so you never really know. All right, so thanks everybody for all of your questions. I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for listening as well. We always have a lot of fun with these shows. I hope that you're getting a little bit out of it. We're going to be doing some experimentation in the coming weeks with different format things, and I'm going to be trying a couple of new segments out. Hopefully you guys like them. You'll certainly let me know if you don't, but please do reach out. And if you can, leave a kind rating and review for the podcast. Make sure you downloaded this, subscribe to it, do whatever you have to do to get your hands on this podcast, and also tell a friend if you would, because the more the merrier. And we'll get more questions and we'll get better content in the end. So hopefully that all works out for you guys. Thanks a lot for joining me this week. A huge thanks to Nico for producing today. Thanks to all of our questioners for sending them in. We will have more Talking Hockey Sense next week. Going to get into the USHL playoffs, the Under-18 Worlds, and an NHL Draft Lottery preview. So much more to get to as we move on. But that is going to do it for this week's episode. My name is Chris Peters. This is Talking Hockey Sense. We'll catch you next time.